The gunshot that killed her husband echoed through the mountains for 3 seconds before Julia Marlowe realized she was a widow at 23 years old. She stood in the dusty street of Aurora, Colorado, watching the blood pool around Thomas's body while the man who shot him mounted his horse and rode away into the November afternoon of 1878. The sheriff would later tell her it was a fair fight, that Thomas had drawn first, that the law couldn't touch a man defending his own life. Julia didn't care about the law. She cared that the man she'd married 6 months ago now lay dead over a gambling debt he'd never told her about, and that she was alone in a mining town 2,000 miles from her family in Boston. The other women in town helped her bury Thomas on a gray hillside where the wind never stopped blowing. They brought her casseroles and sympathy for exactly 1 week, then the kindness dried up like water in summer. A young widow with no children and no family was a problem nobody wanted to solve. The boarding house where she and Thomas had rented a room gave her 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. The general store where she'd worked 3 days a week let her go, hiring the owner's nephew instead. By the end of November, Julia had $17 to her name and nowhere to go. She tried the saloon first, but the owner took one look at her respectable dress and neat brown hair and laughed. "You don't have the face for this work, honey. Too sad. Men don't pay to look at sad." She tried the hotel next, but they just hired a girl from Denver. The laundry wouldn't take her because the Chinese workers did it cheaper. The restaurant said maybe in spring when the miners came back from the high country. December arrived with snow and temperatures that made her bones ache. Julia spent her last $3 on a week's rent in a boarding house on the wrong side of town, where the walls were thin and the roof leaked, and the woman who ran it asked no questions as long as you paid on time. She lay awake at night listening to the sound of men fighting in the street and wondered what happened to women like her, women who fell through the cracks of society's carefully constructed floor. The answer came on a gray Tuesday morning when she saw the advertisement in the church vestibule. Housekeeper wanted. Room and board plus $20 monthly. Must be honest, hardworking, and of good character. Inquire at the Vance Ranch, 5 miles north of town. Julia copied the address with a stub of pencil on a scrap of paper. She'd never been a housekeeper, but she was honest and she worked hard and she needed those $20 like she needed air. She put on her best dress, the dark green wool she'd worn to Thomas's funeral, and borrowed a horse from the livery in exchange for mucking stalls for 2 hours. The Vance Ranch sat in a valley between 2 ridges of pine-covered mountains. The house was larger than she'd expected, a 2-story structure of rough-hewn logs with a wide porch and glass windows that reflected the weak winter sun. The barn was well-maintained, the fences were straight, and she could see cattle grazing in a distant pasture. Whoever owned this place had money and knew how to manage land. She tied the horse to the porch rail and knocked. Nobody answered. She knocked again, louder this time, and heard the sound of boots on wooden floors. The door opened, and a man looked down at her with the bluest eyes she'd ever seen. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw shadowed with several days of stubble. He wore canvas work pants and a shirt with the sleeves rolled up despite the cold, and there was a wariness in his expression that made her think of wounded animals. He couldn't have been more than 30, but he had the look of someone who'd lived twice that long. "Help you?" His voice was rough, like he didn't use it often. "I'm here about the housekeeper position." Julia straightened her shoulders and met his eyes. "My name is Julia Marlowe." He studied her for a long moment. "You're Thomas Marlowe's widow." It wasn't a question. In a town the size of Aurora, everyone knew everyone's business. "Yes," He owed me $200. Julia's stomach dropped. I don't have $200. Didn't figure you did. The man stepped back and gestured inside. Come in, cold out there. The interior of the house was clean but sparse, furnished with the basics and nothing more. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, a table and 4 chairs sat near the kitchen, and a staircase led to the second floor. Everything was neat and orderly, but there was a loneliness to it that Julia recognized because she felt it in her own bones. Name's Zachary Vance. He moved to the fireplace and added a log. Most people call me Zach, Mr. Vance. She clasped her hands in front of her. About the money my husband owed you, forget it. He turned to face her. Dead men don't pay debts and I don't collect from widows. You want coffee? She nodded, surprised. He poured 2 cups from a pot on the stove and handed her one. It was strong and hot and exactly what she needed. The job's real, Zach said. I need someone to keep the house, do the cooking, mending, that sort of thing. I run cattle, which means I'm up before dawn and out until after dark most days. Place has been getting away from me. He paused and something shifted in his expression. Had a housekeeper before, woman named Mrs. Patterson. She worked for me for 3 years, but she died in October. Heart gave out. I'm sorry. She was a good woman. Zach drank his coffee in silence for a moment. Job comes with your own room upstairs, 3 meals a day and $20 a month. Work steady, but it's not easy. I'm not easy. I don't talk much, I keep to myself, and I expect things done right. But I'm fair and I pay on time and I don't tolerate any nonsense. That suit you? Julia thought about her $17, the boarding house with its leaking roof, the way the store owners in town looked through her like she was already a ghost. Yes, she said. That suits me fine. You can start tomorrow if you want. Bring whatever you've got and take the room at the end of the hall upstairs. Mrs. Patterson's old room. They shook hands, his grip firm and calloused, and Julia rode back to town feeling like maybe she could breathe again. She packed her few belongings that night, paid the boarding house woman through the end of the week even though she wouldn't be staying, and said goodbye to exactly nobody, because there was nobody to say goodbye to. The next morning, she loaded her trunk onto a wagon she'd rented with her last dollars and drove out to the Vance ranch as the sun was rising over the mountains. Zach met her in the yard, helped her carry the trunk upstairs, and showed her the room that would be hers. It was small but clean, with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the valley. After the boarding house, it felt like a palace. Kitchen stocked, Zach said from the doorway. Make whatever you want for meals. I'm not particular. I'll be out with the cattle most of the day. He hesitated. Glad to have you here, Mrs. Marlowe. Julia, she said. You can call me Julia. He nodded and left, his boots heavy on the stairs. She heard the front door close and then the sound of a horse riding away. She stood in her new room, looking out at the snow-covered valley, and felt something she hadn't felt since Thomas died. Hope. The work was exactly as hard as Zach had promised. The house was large and accumulated dust like it had a personal vendetta. The stove was temperamental and required constant attention. The washing took hours, especially in winter when everything had to be dried inside and the whole house smelled like damp wool. But Julia had never been afraid of hard work, and she'd rather break her back cleaning than starve in town. She learned Zach's routines quickly. He woke before sunrise and expected breakfast ready when he came downstairs. Coffee, eggs, bacon, biscuits. He ate in silence, reading week-old newspapers he bought in town. He worked outside until noon, came in for a quick lunch, then went back out until dark. Dinner was at 7, and he usually retreated to the small office off the main room afterward to work on his accounts. He was in bed by 9. They barely spoke for the first 2 weeks. Julia cooked and cleaned and mended and tried to stay out of his way. Zach worked with his cattle and his horses and came inside only when necessary. It was a strange, quiet existence, but after the chaos of Thomas's death and the hostility of town, Julia found she didn't mind the silence. The first real conversation they had was on a Sunday in mid-December. Julia had made pot roast for dinner, and Zach actually sat at the table instead of eating standing up like he usually did. "This is good," he said, chewing slowly. "Real good. You're a fine cook." "Thank you." She poured herself more water. "My mother taught me." She said a woman who couldn't cook was a woman who'd never keep a husband. The words were out before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted bringing up marriage and husbands. But Zach just nodded. "Your mother was probably right, though I expect there's more to keeping a husband than cooking. Apparently I wasn't very good at any of it." Julia stared at her plate. "Thomas and I were only married 6 months. That wasn't your fault." Thomas Marlowe was a fool who couldn't stay away from cards and whiskey. Everyone in town knew it. The bluntness should have offended her, but instead it was almost a relief. Nobody else had been honest about Thomas, preferring to dance around the truth with platitudes about tragic accidents and unfortunate circumstances. "I didn't know it," she said quietly. "When I married him, I thought he was steady, responsible. He told me he worked at the mining office, that he had a good position. I didn't find out until after the wedding that he'd been fired 2 months before for drinking on the job." "Why'd you marry him?" It was a bold question, maybe too bold, but something about Zach's direct manner made her want to answer honestly. "I came out here with my aunt last spring. She was joining her son in Denver, and I came along because there was nothing left for me in Boston. My parents died of fever when I was 19. I'd been working as a governess, but the family let me go when their children got older. My aunt said Colorado was full of opportunities for young women, new starts. And Thomas was a new start. He seemed like one." She met Zach's eyes across the table. "He was charming and attentive, and he made me feel like I mattered. I was lonely and he was there, and I convinced myself that was the same as love. I was wrong." Zach was quiet for a moment. "We all make mistakes. Some of us just pay higher prices for them." There was something in his tone that made her curious. "What mistakes have you made?" He pushed his plate away and stood. "More than I can count. Thank you for dinner." And then he was gone, leaving her alone with the dishes and 100 unanswered questions. December turned into January, and the snow piled higher in the valley. Zach taught Julia how to handle the livestock when the weather was too bad for him to manage alone. She learned to break ice in the water troughs, scatter hay for the cattle, and gentle the skittish horses in the barn. Her hands got rough and her back ached constantly, but she felt stronger than she ever had in Boston, where ladies weren't supposed to do anything more strenuous than needlepoint. They talked more as the weeks passed. Small conversations at first, about the weather and the work and the way the coyotes howled at night. Then longer ones, about books they'd read and places they'd been, and the strange loneliness of the Western Territories. Julia learned that Zach had grown up in Kansas, that he'd come to Colorado 5 years ago with money he'd saved from working as a ranch hand. He'd built this place from nothing, every fence post and roof beam a testament to his determination. "Why ranching?" she asked one evening as they ate dinner. "You could have done anything. Ranching's honest work, just you and the animals and the land, nobody telling you what to do or who to be." He cut his steak with precise movements. "I like the quiet. Too many people makes me nervous." "You must have hated the war then." She saw him tense, his knife freezing mid-cut. "How'd you know about that?" "You have a scar on your left shoulder. I saw it when you were hauling water last week. It looks like a bullet wound." Zach set down his silverware carefully, fought for the Union. Enlisted in '62 when I was 17, mustered out in '65. Did my part and came home. That must have been terrible. It was war, nothing good about it. His voice had gone flat. Lost a lot of friends, saw things nobody should see. When it was over, I just wanted to find someplace quiet where I could forget. Julia understood that impulse more than he knew. She'd wanted to forget too, when her parents died and left her alone in a world that had no place for orphaned young women without money or connections. She'd wanted to forget when Thomas died and the town turned its back on her. Maybe that was what this ranch was for both of them, a place to forget. February arrived with a blizzard that lasted 3 days. The snow was so thick Julia couldn't see the barn from the house. Zach spent hours outside making sure the animals survived, coming in with ice in his beard, and his fingers so cold he couldn't unfasten his coat. Julia heated water and made him soup, and worried he'd freeze to death trying to save his cattle. On the 3rd night of the storm, he came in shaking so badly he could barely walk. She got him out of his wet clothes without thinking about propriety, wrapped him in blankets, and made him sit by the fire with hot coffee laced with whiskey. His lips were blue and his teeth were chattering, and she'd never been so frightened in her life. "Stupid," he muttered through chattering teeth. "Should have come in sooner." "You're not stupid, you're stubborn. There's a difference." She rubbed his hands between hers, trying to get the blood flowing. "The cattle aren't worth dying for. Those cattle are my whole life. Your life is worth more than cattle." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them that Julia couldn't name. It was like a door opening in a room she didn't know existed. "Is it?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said, and meant it with every part of herself. "It is." They stayed up all night, keeping the fire high and drinking coffee and talking about everything and nothing. Zach told her about growing up poor in Kansas, about his father who drank and his mother who died when he was 12. Julia told him about Boston and her parents and the governess position, where she'd been treated more like a servant than an employee. They talked about loneliness and fear, and the strange courage it took just to keep living when everything fell apart. When the sun finally rose and the storm broke, Julia realized she didn't want to stop talking to him. She liked the way he listened, his full attention focused on her words like they mattered. She liked the rare smile that softened his face. She liked the way he made her feel safe in a world that had never felt safe before. She realized with a shock that made her breath catch, falling in love with him. The realization terrified her. She'd loved Thomas, or thought she had, and look how that ended. She didn't trust her own judgment anymore. And even if her feelings were real, what if Zach didn't feel the same way? He'd hired her as a housekeeper, not a potential wife. She couldn't risk losing this job, this home, this fragile security she'd built. So she pushed the feelings down and tried to pretend everything was exactly as it had been. But everything had changed, and Zach seemed to know it too. He started coming inside earlier in the evenings. He lingered over dinner instead of rushing through it. He asked her questions about her day, her thoughts, her dreams for the future. Once, she caught him watching her while she kneaded bread, his expression so tender it made her heart ache. March brought warmer weather and the first signs of spring. The snow melted in patches, revealing brown grass and muddy earth. The cattle got restless, ready for green pastures. Zach spent long days repairing fences and checking his stock, preparing for the seasonal drive to summer grazing lands in the high country. Julia planted a garden behind the house, turning the cold soil with a spade Zach had sharpened for her. She put in seeds for vegetables and herbs, imagining how the yard would look in summer with rows of green growth. It felt like planting a future, putting down roots in this place that had become home. One evening in late March, Zach came in from work and found her in the garden, her skirts muddy and her hair falling out of its pins. She was laughing at herself, at the mess she'd made, at the pure joy of working with living things instead of dust and laundry. "You look happy," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up. "I am happy." She stood and brushed dirt from her hands. "I haven't been happy in a long time, but I am now." "Good." He took a step closer. "Julia, I need to tell you something." Her heart started pounding. "What is it?" "I didn't just hire you because I needed a housekeeper." The words came out in a rush, like he'd been holding them back for months. "I hired you because when you showed up on my porch that day, you were the first person in years who looked at me like I was human. Everyone else in town sees me as that hermit rancher who keeps to himself. But you just saw me, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since." Julia couldn't breathe. "Zach, let me finish." He ran a hand through his hair, agitated. "I know you probably don't feel the same way. I know I'm not much of a catch. I'm too quiet and too rough around the edges, and I've got more ghosts than any one man should carry. But I care about you, Julia. More than I've ever cared about anyone. And if there's even a chance you might feel something for me too, I need to know." She closed the distance between them in 3 steps and kissed him. It wasn't graceful or practiced, just honest and full of all the feelings she'd been trying to suppress. He froze for a heartbeat, then his arms came around her and he was kissing her back with a desperation that matched her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Julia laughed through tears she didn't remember starting to cry. "I've been in love with you since February," she said. "Since the blizzard, when you nearly froze to death and I realized I couldn't stand the thought of losing you. Julia." He said her name like a prayer, like something sacred. "Are you sure? After Thomas and I were never really married, not the way marriage should be. We were 2 lonely people who convinced ourselves that was enough." She took his face in her hands. "But what I feel for you is different. It's real and it's deep and it scares me because I don't know what I'd do if I lost it. You won't lose it." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips again. "You won't lose me. I promise." They stood in the garden as the sun set behind the mountains, holding each other like they could keep the world at bay through sheer force of will. Julia had never felt so certain of anything in her life. This was what love was supposed to be, steady and strong and built on mutual respect and understanding. This was home. They courted properly after that, despite the fact that they lived under the same roof. Zach insisted on it, said he wanted to do things right. He brought her wildflowers from the meadows and took her riding through the foothills on Sunday afternoons. He held her hand across the dinner table and kissed her good night at her bedroom door like a gentleman, even though she could see the restraint it cost him. Julia had never been courted like this. Thomas had been all flash and charm, sweeping her off her feet with grand gestures that meant nothing. Zach was different. Every small kindness, every gentle touch, every moment of shared silence was a promise. He loved her with his actions, not just his words, and that made all the difference. In April, he asked her to marry him. They were sitting on the porch watching the stars come out, her head on his shoulder and his arm around her waist. He didn't have a ring and he didn't get down on one knee. He just turned to her and said, "I want you to be my wife. I want to spend every day for the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, and then again, "Yes, yes, yes." They married in May in the small church in Aurora. There were no guests except the preacher's wife who served as witness and the store owner who stood up for Zach. Julia wore a simple blue dress she'd made herself, and Zach wore his Sunday suit that still smelled faintly of cedar from the trunk where he'd stored it. The ceremony was short, and the vows were simple, but when Zach slid a plain gold band onto her finger, Julia felt like she'd finally found the place she belonged. They spent their wedding night in the house that was now legally theirs, not just his. Zach carried her over the threshold even though she laughed and said it was silly. He made love to her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes, and afterward they lay tangled together in the big bed, talking about the future in whispers. "I want children," Zach said, his hand on her stomach. "Lots of them. Fill this house with noise and laughter." Julia's breath caught. She'd known this moment would come, but she'd been dreading it since the day he proposed. She couldn't put it off any longer. She sat up, pulling the sheet around her, and forced herself to meet his eyes. "Zach, there's something I need to tell you." He propped himself up on one elbow, concern creasing his brow. "What is it?" The words stuck in her throat like broken glass. She'd never said them out loud before, not to anyone, because saying them made them real and terrible. But he deserved the truth. "I cannot bear children." The silence that followed was absolute. Zach stared at her, processing the words, and Julia wanted to die. She'd ruined everything. He'd married her expecting a family, and now she was telling him she couldn't give him that. He would regret marrying her. He would resent her. Maybe he would even send her away. "How do you know?" His voice was careful, neutral. "I had a fever when I was 17. Scarlet fever. I nearly died." The words came easier now, like lancing a wound. "The doctor told my mother afterward that the fever had damaged something inside me. He said I would probably never conceive, and if I did, I likely wouldn't carry to term. When Thomas and I married, I didn't tell him. I thought maybe the doctor was wrong, that maybe I'd get pregnant anyway, but I never did, and now I never will." She waited for anger, for disappointment, for rejection, but Zach just pulled her back down beside him and wrapped his arms around her. "Then we'll fill our home with love," he said simply. Julia pulled back to look at him, sure she'd misheard. "What? You heard me." He brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "We'll fill our home with love. We have each other, and that's more than most people ever get. If we can't have biological children, we'll find another way. There are children in this world who need parents, who need homes. We can give them that." "You're not angry." "Angry?" He looked genuinely confused. "Julia, I didn't marry you to get children. I married you because I love you. Because you make me laugh, and you're not afraid of hard work, and you look at the world like it still has good things in it, despite everything that's tried to beat that out of you. Children would be wonderful, but they're not why I want you in my life." She started crying in earnest then, great heaving sobs of relief and gratitude and love. Zach held her through all of it, murmuring reassurances and pressing kisses to her hair. When she finally calmed down, she felt lighter than she had in years. "I love you," she said. "I love you so much." "I love you too." He smiled, that rare, beautiful smile that transformed his whole face. "Now let's talk about this plan to fill our home. How do you feel about orphans?" They talked late into the night about possibilities and plans. There were orphan trains that came through Colorado regularly, bringing children from overcrowded eastern cities to new homes in the West. There were Indian schools run by the government, full of children separated from their families. There were mining camps where accidents left children parentless, and ranches where families got too large to support. The West was full of children who needed homes, and Julia and Zach had a home that needed children. Summer arrived with warm winds and endless blue skies. Julia's garden flourished, producing more vegetables than two people could eat. Zach's cattle grew fat on mountain grass. They worked hard from sunrise to sunset, but the work felt different now. It felt like building something permanent, creating a foundation for the family they would have. In July, they went to Denver to speak with the Children's Aid Society. The woman who ran the office was stern and skeptical. asking pointed questions about their finances and their motivations and their ability to care for orphan children. But when Zach explained that they had a working ranch with steady income and a desire to provide a real home, not just cheap labor, her expression softened. "We have a train arriving next month," she said. 20 children between the ages of 5 and 14. "If you're serious about this, you can meet the train in Aurora and see if any of the children might be a good fit for your family." They left Denver with nervous excitement bubbling in their chests. A month felt like forever and no time at all. They spent the weeks preparing, turning the spare bedrooms into spaces for children. Julia sewed curtains and quilts. Zach built a new bunk bed and repaired the old one from his childhood that he'd stored in the barn. They were nesting, creating a home that could hold more than just the two of them. The train arrived on a hot August afternoon. Julia and Zach stood on the platform with dozens of other couples and families, all hoping to take a child home. When the orphans filed off the train, Julia's heart broke. They were so small, so thin, so scared. They wore donated clothes that didn't fit and looked at the crowd with a mixture of hope and terror. The children stood in a line while the society representative explained the process. Interested families could speak with the children, ask questions, see if there was a connection. It felt wrong to Julia, this display of needy children like goods at a market. But she understood the practicality of it. These children needed homes, and this was how homes were found. She and Zach walked along the line slowly, meeting eyes and offering smiles. Some children shied away. Others stared with desperate intensity. Near the end of the line, Julia saw a girl of about 8 with tangled red hair and a face full of freckles. She was holding the hand of a smaller boy, maybe 5, with the same red hair and the same freckles. "Hello," Julia said gently, crouching down to their level. "What are your names?" The girl lifted her chin. "I'm Sarah. This is my brother Michael. We stay together." "Of course you stay together," Zach said from behind Julia. "Brothers and sisters should stay together." Sarah's defiance cracked slightly. "You mean it? Other people said they'd take me but not Michael, but I won't leave him. He's all I got. We mean it." Julia looked at Michael, who was sucking his thumb and looking at her with enormous blue eyes. "Tell us about yourselves." Sarah told their story in a flat voice, like she'd repeated it too many times. Their parents died of cholera in New York City. They'd been living on the streets for 6 months before the society found them. Sarah had kept them alive by begging and stealing and doing whatever was necessary. She was 8 years old and she'd been responsible for another human being for half a year. Julia wanted to gather her up and never let anything hurt her again. "Can you read?" Zach asked. Sarah shook her head. "Never had schooling, but I'm smart. I can learn." "I'm sure you can." He looked at Julia and she saw the question in his eyes. She nodded. "Sarah, Michael, how would you like to come home with us? We have a ranch with horses and cattle and room to run. We can teach you to read and ride and do all sorts of things. And you'll always have enough to eat and a warm place to sleep. You want both of us." Sarah's voice cracked on the last word. "We want both of you," Julia confirmed. "We want a family, and families stick together." Sarah started crying, and then Michael started crying because his sister was crying. And Julia found herself crying too as she pulled both children into a hug. Zach put his big hand on Sarah's head and promised that everything would be all right. And Julia believed him because Zach never made promises he couldn't keep. The paperwork took 2 hours. The society wanted references and proof of income and assurances that the children would be educated and cared for properly. Julia signed papers until her hand cramped, and then they were free to go. They had 2 children. They had a family. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Sarah sat stiff and watchful. Michael clutched a battered cloth dog that was his only possession. Julia made conversation about the ranch and the animals, but she could see the children didn't quite believe this was real. They'd probably been disappointed too many times to trust easily. When they pulled up to the house, Sarah's eyes went wide. "That's where we're living. That's home," Zach said, lifting Michael down from the wagon. "Come on, I'll show you around." The children explored cautiously at first, then with growing enthusiasm as they realized they really were allowed to touch things, to go into rooms, to claim space as their own. Sarah fell in love with the bedroom Julia had prepared, with its blue curtains and the quilt covered in yellow flowers. Michael was more interested in the horses in the barn, begging Zach to let him pet them. That first night was chaos. Michael wouldn't eat because he didn't recognize the food. Sarah ate like she might never see food again, making herself sick. The bath was a battle, because apparently the children hadn't been properly bathed in months, and didn't understand why it was necessary. Getting them into nightclothes and into bed took over an hour, and then Michael started crying for his mother and wouldn't stop until Julia lay down beside him and sang lullabies her own mother had sung. When she finally made it back downstairs, exhausted and covered in bath water, she found Zach sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. "What did we do?" he asked. Julia started laughing. She couldn't help it. "We became parents. They're terrified. They don't trust us. Michael wouldn't even look at me during dinner. They're children who have lost everything and been shipped halfway across the country on a train. Of course they're terrified." She sat beside him and took his hand. "But they're here now. They're safe. We'll earn their trust one day at a time. What if we're not good at this? Then we'll figure it out together." She squeezed his fingers. "We're in this together, remember?" He pulled her into his lap and held her tight. "I love you. I love you too, even when you panic." "I'm not panicking. You're absolutely panicking." He laughed then, the tension breaking, and kissed her until she forgot how tired she was. The first weeks with Sarah and Michael were difficult in ways Julia hadn't anticipated. The children had been through trauma that manifested in unexpected ways. Sarah hoarded food in her room, hiding biscuits and apples under her bed because she didn't believe there would be more tomorrow. Michael had nightmares every night, waking up screaming about monsters that turned out to be memories of seeing his parents die. Neither child knew how to play or relax or just be children, but slowly, so slowly Julia almost didn't notice it happening, things got better. Sarah stopped hoarding food when she realized breakfast appeared every morning without fail. Michael started sleeping through the night after Zach made him a small wooden horse he could hold while he slept. They both began to smile more, to ask questions, to venture opinions about what they wanted for dinner, or which chores they preferred. Julia taught them to read using an old primer she'd ordered from a catalog. Sarah was hungry for knowledge, absorbing everything Julia could teach her. Michael was more interested in the ranch work, following Zach around and copying his movements. They were finding their places in this new family, figuring out who they could be when they weren't just fighting to survive. In September, Julia took them to town to buy new clothes and shoes. She'd been dreading this trip, knowing that Aurora's residents would have opinions about the former widow and her rancher husband adopting orphans. Sure enough, the whispers started the moment they walked into the general store. "Those are orphan-trained children," someone muttered. "Who knows what kind of bad blood they've got? Probably disease-ridden," someone else added. "Shouldn't be allowed around decent folk." Julia felt Sarah tense beside her and saw the shame flood the little girl's face. Before she could respond, Zach stepped forward. "My children are as decent as any in this town," he said, his voice hard as iron. "More decent than some, seeing as how they've actually suffered and learned compassion. Anyone who has a problem with my family can take it up with me directly." The store went silent. Zach was known as a quiet man, but everyone also knew he'd been a soldier and could handle himself in a fight. Nobody wanted to take him up on his offer. "Now," Zach continued, "we're here to buy clothes for Sarah and Michael. Anyone who can't be civil can leave." Nobody left, but nobody bothered them either. Julia selected fabric for new dresses and shirts, shoes that actually fit, winter coats for the cold months ahead. At the counter, the owner totaled up the bill without comment and took Zach's money without meeting his eyes. On the walk back to the wagon, Sarah slipped her hand into Zach's. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saying we're your children." Zach stopped walking and knelt down so he was eye level with her. "Sarah, you are my child, you and Michael both. Maybe I didn't get you the usual way, but that doesn't make you any less mine. You understand?" She nodded, tears streaming down her freckled face, and threw her arms around his neck. Michael joined the hug a moment later, and Julia stood watching with her own tears falling. This was what family looked like. Not blood ties or legal documents, but choice and commitment and love. Fall arrived with cooler temperatures and trees turning gold in the mountains. The children had been with them for 3 months, and the house felt full in the best possible way. There was noise and laughter and the constant chaos of raising 2 active children. Julia was more tired than she'd ever been in her life, but also happier. This was what she'd wanted without knowing how to name it: a home full of love. One evening in October, as they were finishing dinner, Sarah asked, "Can we call you Ma and Pa?" Julia's fork clattered onto her plate. She looked at Zach and saw her own surprise and joy reflected in his face. "If you want to," Zach said carefully. "We'd be honored." "We want to," Michael piped up. "You're our Ma and Pa now, the other ones are gone." It should have been sad, but it wasn't. It was just honest. Their biological parents were gone, and Julia and Zach were here, and that was how families worked. You loved the people who were present, who showed up, who stayed. "Then yes," Julia said, her voice thick with emotion. "Call us Ma and Pa." The children beamed, and Julia realized that she and Zach had done exactly what they'd promised on their wedding night. They'd filled their home with love. Winter came early that year, with snow falling in November and temperatures dropping below 0. But the house was warm and full, and Julia found she didn't mind being snowed in when she had her family around her. She taught Sarah to bake bread and sew simple stitches. Zach taught Michael to whittle and care for the horses. They played games in the evening and read stories by the fireplace. They were building traditions, creating memories, becoming the family none of them had been born into but all of them had chosen. In December, a letter arrived from the Children's Aid Society. Another train was coming in January, and they had siblings again, a set of twins, boy and girl, age 6. Their father had been killed in a mining accident, and their mother had died giving birth to a stillborn baby. They had no other family. Would the Vance family be interested? Julia and Zach discussed it that night after the children were asleep. The house was already full, their days already packed with work and childcare. Taking 2 more children would be harder, but it would also be right. "We have the room," Zach said. "We have the resources, and those children need a home. Sarah and Michael might struggle with sharing attention, or they might love having younger children to look after. Sarah's got a protective streak a mile wide." Julia thought about that 8-year-old girl who'd refused to be separated from her brother, who'd kept them both alive through sheer determination. "You're right. She'd be a wonderful big sister to younger kids. So we're doing this. We're doing this." They told Sarah and Michael the next morning at breakfast. Sarah's face lit up. "Really? We're getting more siblings. If you're all right with it," Julia said. "It means less attention for you two, more people sharing the house." "I think it's grand," Sarah declared. "I always wanted brothers and sisters. Well, besides Michael, he's a pest." "Am not," Michael protested, but he was grinning too. In January, they met the train again. The twins were named Emma and Ethan, and they had matching dark hair and dark eyes and looked impossibly small standing on the platform in clothes too thin for Colorado winter. Sarah marched right up to them and announced that she was their big sister now, and they'd better listen to what she said. The twins, overwhelmed and scared, just nodded. Bringing them home was easier the second time. Julia and Zach knew what to expect now. The fear, the hoarding, the nightmares. They were patient and consistent, and Sarah helped by taking the twins under her wing and showing them the ropes. Within a month, Emma and Ethan were starting to relax. Within 2 months, they were calling Julia and Zach Ma and Pa just like the older children did. The house was chaos now, but it was joyful chaos. 4 children meant constant noise and activity and mess. It meant more laundry and more cooking and less sleep. But it also meant the sound of laughter echoing through the rooms. It meant small bodies piled on the sofa for story time. It meant Zach teaching all 4 children to ride horses on Sunday afternoons. It meant Julia watching her husband become the father he was always meant to be. In March, the circuit judge came through Aurora. Julia and Zach went to town and legally adopted all 4 children, making them Vances in the eyes of the law. The judge had them stand before him with their hands on a Bible and swear to provide for these children, to educate them, to raise them as their own. It was the easiest oath Julia had ever sworn. That night, they had a celebration dinner with cake and candles. Zach made a speech about family being the people you choose, not the people you're born to. Sarah made one about how they were the luckiest kids in the world. Michael just ate 3 pieces of cake and fell asleep at the table. As Julia carried him up to bed, his arms around her neck and his breath warm on her shoulder, she thought about that terrible November day when she'd stood in the street watching her first husband's blood soak into the dirt. She'd thought her life was over then. She'd thought she'd used up all her chances at happiness. But life, she'd learned, was full of second chances, third chances, as many chances as you were brave enough to take. She'd lost one husband and gained another. She'd lost the ability to bear children and gained 4 anyway. She'd lost everything and found herself richer than she'd ever imagined. Spring arrived with wildflowers and warm winds, and Julia planted her garden again, this time with 4 small helpers who were more interested in playing in the dirt than actually planting anything. The garden ended up lopsided and chaotic, but she loved it anyway because it was theirs, made together as a family. One evening in April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Zach put his arm around Julia and pulled her close. "Happy?" he asked. "Happier than I knew how to be." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Thank you, for what? For not caring that I couldn't give you children, for finding another way, for loving me enough to build this life." He kissed the top of her head. "Julia, you gave me everything. You gave me love and purpose and a reason to come home at the end of the day. The children are wonderful, but I would have been happy with just you. Everything else is extra." From inside the house came the sound of Sarah and Michael arguing over whose turn it was to do dishes, followed by Emma's high-pitched laugh and Ethan shouting something incomprehensible. It was loud and messy and far from peaceful. It was perfect. The years that followed were full and rich. Sarah grew into a smart, capable young woman who wanted to be a teacher. Michael discovered a gift for working with horses and started breaking colts for neighboring ranches. Emma showed artistic talent, filling pages with sketches of the mountains and animals. Ethan was the comedian of the family, always making everyone laugh with his observations and impressions. They weren't perfect. There were fights and tears and moments when Julia wondered if she was doing anything right. Sarah went through a phase at 13 where she was angry at everyone, especially Julia. Michael broke his arm falling off a horse and scared everyone half to death. The twins struggled in school and needed extra tutoring. Raising children was hard work with no guarantees, but it was also joy. It was Sarah reading stories to the younger children. It was Michael teaching Ethan to ride. It was Emma making birthday cards for everyone. It was family dinners where everyone talked at once, and nobody could hear anything, but everyone felt heard anyway. In 1883, 5 years after Julia had arrived at the ranch with nothing but $17 in desperation, they got a letter from the orphanage asking if they'd consider one more child. A boy, age 7, whose parents had been killed by influenza. He was quiet and withdrawn and having trouble finding a family because he wouldn't speak. Julia and Zach didn't even have to discuss it. They made the trip to Denver and met a small, dark-haired boy with haunted eyes who reminded Julia painfully of Zach the first time she'd seen him. They brought him home and named him Thomas, after Julia's first husband, because everyone deserved to be remembered with love. Thomas didn't speak for 6 months, but he slowly came out of his shell, drawn by the warmth and chaos of the Vance family. Sarah read to him every night. Michael taught him to feed the chickens. The twins included him in their games with the patience of children who remembered being scared and lost. And one day in December, Thomas looked at Julia and said, "Ma, I'm hungry." She cried for 10 minutes straight while Thomas looked worried that he'd done something wrong. But they were happy tears, joyful tears, the kind that came from watching miracles unfold one small word at a time. By 1885, the house was bursting at the seams. 5 children between the ages of 7 and 15 meant noise and energy and constant motion. Zach built an addition onto the house, adding 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The ranch had prospered, the cattle herd growing with each passing year. They hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, young men who lived in the bunkhouse and treated the Vance children like younger siblings. Julia looked at her life and marveled at how far she'd come. She was 30 years old, married to a man she loved more with each passing year, mother to 5 children who called her Ma and meant it. She had a home and a purpose and more love than she'd ever thought possible. One night, lying in bed with Zach's arm around her, she said, "Do you ever regret it? Marrying me when you knew I couldn't give you biological children." He propped himself up on one elbow and looked down at her. "Julia, I have 5 children downstairs who are as much mine as if I'd sired them myself. I have a wife who is my partner in everything. I have a home full of laughter and life. Why would I regret any of that? I just want to make sure you're happy. I'm the happiest man in Colorado, maybe in the whole country." He kissed her softly. "You gave me a family when I didn't even know I wanted one. You turned this lonely ranch into a home. You loved me when I was too broken to believe I deserved love. If that's not enough, I don't know what is." She pulled him down for another kiss, this one deeper, full of promise. They made love slowly, quietly, mindful of the children sleeping down the hall. Afterward, as Zach drifted off to sleep, Julia stayed awake a while longer, listening to the sounds of her house settling and thinking about all the ways love could grow. The children grew and changed, as children do. Sarah left at 18 to attend normal school in Denver, determined to become a teacher. She wrote home every week, long letters full of her studies and her dreams and her gratitude for the family that had given her a chance at education. Michael took over more of the ranch work, showing a natural gift for managing cattle and horses. He started courting a girl from town, a sweet-natured young woman who fit into the family like she'd always been there. The twins turned 16 and started making plans of their own. Emma wanted to study art, though she worried about the impracticality of it. Ethan was interested in law, fascinated by the idea of using words to change things. Thomas, now 12, was still quiet but no longer silent. He'd found his voice and used it sparingly but well, usually to say things that made everyone stop and think. Julia and Zach watched their children grow with pride and a little sadness. This was the goal, they reminded each other. Raising children who could leave and build their own lives. But it was still hard to watch the house empty, to see the family they'd built begin to scatter. In 1892, when Julia was 37 and Zach was 42, they got word of another orphan train. They hadn't taken in a new child in 7 years, and Julia thought they were done. But Zach saw the notice and looked at her with question in his eyes. "One more?" he asked. Julia laughed. "We're getting too old for this. Speak for yourself. I'm in my prime. You need a cane on cold mornings." "That's beside the point." He took her hand. "There's room in the house again with Sarah and Michael grown, and I'm not ready to stop being a father yet." She understood that feeling. The house felt too quiet with only 3 children left, and those 3 would be grown and gone before she knew it. There was still love to give, still space to fill. "All right," she said. "One more." They went to Aurora in June to meet the train. Most of the children were young, under 10, but Julia's eyes were drawn to a girl standing at the end of the line. She was tall for her age, maybe 14, with dark skin and tightly braided hair. She wasn't crying like some of the younger children, but her eyes held a wariness that Julia recognized. "Hello," Julia said, approaching carefully. "What's your name?" "Rebecca." The girl's voice was soft but steady. "Rebecca Johnson. I'm Julia Vance. This is my husband, Zach. Tell me about yourself, Rebecca." The girl's story came out in pieces. Her mother had been freed from slavery before the war, had made her way north to New York and built a life. Rebecca had been born free, but her mother died when she was 12 and she had no other family. She'd been living in an orphanage for 2 years, passed over by families who didn't want a black child or thought she was too old to be worth the trouble. "I can read and write and do sums," Rebecca said, her chin lifted defiantly. "I'm strong and I work hard. I won't be any trouble." Julia's heart broke for this girl who'd learned to sell herself like she was applying for a job instead of hoping for a family. "Rebecca, we're not looking for a worker. We're looking for a daughter. Do you understand the difference?" The defiance cracked. "Why would you want me? I'm colored and I'm almost grown. Nobody wants girls like me." "We do," Zach said quietly, "if you'll have us." Rebecca stared at them like they were speaking a foreign language. Julia understood. The girl had been rejected so many times she didn't know how to accept being chosen. "Come home with us," Julia said. "Give us a chance. If you don't like it, we'll bring you back, but I think you will like it. We have a good family. 3 other children still at home, a ranch with horses and mountains and room to breathe, and we'd be honored if you'd be part of it." Rebecca came home with them, disbelieving and defensive and waiting for the catch. The other children welcomed her warily at first, unsure how to approach this almost grown stranger. But Emma saw a fellow artist in Rebecca and started sharing her sketches. Ethan made her laugh with his terrible jokes. Thomas, with the wisdom of someone who'd been silent and scared himself, just accepted her presence without demanding anything in return. It took months for Rebecca to relax, to believe that this wasn't temporary, that the Vances weren't going to change their minds. She excelled at everything she tried, driven by a need to prove her worth. Julia finally sat her down one evening and said, "You don't have to earn your place here. You already have it just by being you." "But I'm not really yours," Rebecca said. "Not like the others." None of my children are mine by birth, Rebecca. Every single one was chosen. You're as much my daughter as Sarah or Emma or any of them. Julia took her hand. The color of your skin doesn't matter to us. What matters is that you're part of this family now. Will you let yourself believe that? Rebecca started crying, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. Julia held her while she cried, this almost grown girl who'd had to be strong for far too long. When the storm finally passed, Rebecca whispered, "Thank you, Ma." Those 2 words were worth everything. Rebecca bloomed in the Vance household. She discovered a love of learning and spent hours reading everything she could find. She helped with the younger children, patient and kind in ways that suggested she'd make a wonderful teacher or nurse. She and Emma became inseparable, 2 creative souls who understood each other without words. In 1895, Sarah came home from Denver with news. She'd been offered a teaching position in a small town in Wyoming. She was taking it, and she was also engaged to a lawyer she'd met at school. The wedding would be in the fall. Julia helped Sarah make her wedding dress, her needle flying through white silk while Sarah chattered about her fiancé and her new job and her excitement about the future. It was bittersweet, this letting go. Sarah had been there first, the scared little girl who'd protected her brother with everything she had. Now she was a woman, confident and educated and ready for her own life. The wedding was beautiful. They held it at the ranch, with all the children there and Sarah's fiancé's family traveling from Wyoming. Michael stood up for Sarah, and Emma and Rebecca were her attendants. Ethan read poetry. Thomas played guitar, a skill he'd taught himself over the years. Zach walked Sarah down the makeshift aisle with tears streaming down his face, and Julia cried through the entire ceremony. At the reception, Sarah found Julia in the kitchen and hugged her tight. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for giving me a home when I had nothing, for teaching me to read, for loving me even when I was angry and difficult. I wouldn't be here without you and Pa." "You'd have been fine," Julia said, though her voice was thick with tears. "You're the strongest person I know. I learned that from you." Sarah pulled back and smiled. "You showed me what it meant to keep going even when everything falls apart, to build something new from the pieces. I'm going to remember that for the rest of my life." After Sarah left, the house felt different. 1 child gone, 5 still at home, and Julia realized she was 40 years old and had been a mother for 17 years. She'd raised 7 children, though Sarah was the only one fully grown and gone. The others would follow in time. That was the whole point of parenting, to raise children who could leave. But there was still work to do, still children who needed her. Michael was 22 now, running more of the ranch than Zach did, planning to marry his sweetheart in the spring. Emma was 19 and applying to art schools in the East. Ethan was 19 and preparing for law school. Thomas was 17 and considering the ministry. Rebecca was 16 and wanted to be a doctor, though everyone told her that was impossible for a black woman. Julia told her that impossible just meant nobody had done it yet, which wasn't the same as couldn't. The years continued their relentless march. Michael married and brought his wife to live on the ranch, building a small house on the far edge of the property. Emma went to art school in Boston and fell in love with the city. Ethan went to law school in Denver and fell in love with a fellow student. Thomas went to seminary in Kansas. Rebecca defied everyone's expectations and got accepted to a women's medical college in Philadelphia, one of the few that would take a black student. By 1900, all the children were grown and gone, scattered across the country pursuing dreams that Julia and Zach had helped them build. The house was quiet again, just the 2 of them like it had been in the beginning. Julia found she didn't mind. She and Zach were 55 and 50 respectively, not old by any means but no longer young. They settled into a comfortable rhythm, running the ranch with Michael's help, traveling occasionally to visit their children. They received letters regularly, updates on jobs and engagements, and eventually grandchildren. Sarah had 3 children. Michael had 4. Emma had 2. Ethan had 1. Thomas, who'd become a minister in a small Kansas town, had 6 adopted children of his own, carrying on the family tradition. Rebecca, who'd become a doctor against all odds, had 2 biological children with her husband, a teacher she'd met in Philadelphia. Julia and Zach became grandparents to 18 children, though only some of them were biological grandchildren. It didn't matter. They were all family, connected by love and choice and the legacy Julia and Zach had built. One evening in 1905, as they sat on the porch watching another Colorado sunset, Zach took Julia's hand. "50 years old," he said. "You're getting old, woman." "I'm only 50. You're 60. She squeezed his fingers, still strong despite the arthritis that was starting to creep in. "And you're the one who needs a nap every afternoon." "That's wisdom, not age. I've learned to appreciate rest." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you ever think about that day you showed up here? 27 years ago, scared and broke and desperate, every day." Julia leaned her head on his shoulder. "I think about how close I came to giving up, how easy it would have been to just disappear, and then I think about everything I would have missed if I had. I think about the same thing. I was so lonely before you came. I'd convinced myself that was just how life was, that I'd always be alone. And then you knocked on my door and everything changed." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn pink and gold. Julia thought about all the years they'd had together, all the children they'd raised, all the love they'd built from nothing. She thought about that terrible moment on their wedding night when she'd confessed she couldn't bear children, certain he would reject her. She thought about his response, "Then we'll fill our home with love." They had. They'd filled their home and their lives and their hearts with so much love it had spilled over onto 7 children who'd needed it desperately. They'd created a family not through biology but through choice, and that family had grown and branched and spread across the country. There were now 25 people who called Julia Ma or Grandma, who considered Zach their father or grandfather, who existed because 2 broken people had found each other and decided to build something beautiful. "No regrets?" Zach asked, echoing that conversation from so many years ago. "Not a single one." Julia turned and kissed him, tasting salt and sunset and contentment. "I'd do it all again exactly the same way. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, they made the good parts sweeter." They went inside as the stars came out, 2 people who'd found each other in loneliness and built a legacy of love. The house was quiet now, but it was full of memories and ghosts of laughter and the echoes of all the children who'd grown up within its walls. Julia and Zach had filled their home with love, just as they'd promised, and that love had grown and multiplied and touched more lives than they could count. In the years that followed, they continued to live their quiet life on the ranch, surrounded by the mountains and the memories and the occasional visits from their sprawling family. They grew old together, gracefully and gratefully, holding hands through arthritis and failing eyesight and all the small indignities of aging bodies. In 1915, Zach died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 70. Julia held his hand and whispered that she loved him, that she'd see him again, that he'd been the best thing that ever happened to her. She buried him on the hillside where she'd buried Thomas so many years ago, though this time the grief was different. She'd loved Thomas briefly and desperately. She'd loved Zach deeply and completely, with the kind of love that was woven into the fabric of who she was. She lived another 5 years, surrounded by children and grandchildren who came to stay with her in the house that had held so much love. Sarah moved back to Colorado to be near her. Rebecca came whenever her medical practice allowed. They all visited regularly, bringing their children and their love and their gratitude. Julia died in 1920 at the age of 65, sitting on the porch she'd sat on 1,000 times, watching another Colorado sunset. Sarah was with her, holding her hand, and Julia's last words were, "Tell them I was happy." They buried her next to Zach on that windswept hillside, and all 7 of her children came for the funeral. Sarah and Michael and Emma and Ethan and Thomas and Rebecca, all grown now with families of their own. They stood together and remembered the woman who'd chosen them, who'd loved them, who'd shown them what family could be. At the reception afterward, held in the house that Julia and Zach had filled with love, the grandchildren ran through the rooms and played in the yard and asked questions about the grandparents they'd loved. And the 7 children, now middle-aged adults themselves, told stories. They told about how Julia had taught them to read and to dream, about how Zach had taught them to ride and to work, about how both of them had taught them that family was something you chose, not something you were born into, about how love could grow in the strangest places between the most unexpected people and change the world. One of the grandchildren, a girl of 10 with red hair like Sarah's, asked, "Were Grandma and Grandpa rich?" Sarah smiled. "In every way that mattered." "Did they have a lot of money?" "They had enough, but that's not what made them rich." Sarah looked around the room at her siblings, at their children, at the family that had grown from 2 lonely people who'd found each other in a Colorado winter. They had love, more love than you can imagine. And they gave it freely to anyone who needed it. That's what made them rich. The legacy of Julia and Zach Vance lived on long after they were gone. Their children carried it forward, adopting children of their own, opening their homes to those who needed refuge, creating communities built on compassion and choice. The 7 children who'd been orphans became parents and grandparents themselves, and they made sure their own children knew the story of how they'd been chosen, how they'd been loved, how 2 people had looked at broken children and seen family. The ranch eventually passed to Michael, who ran it with his sons until he died. Then it passed to his eldest daughter, who turned part of it into a home for orphan children, carrying on the family tradition in a more formal way. For 3 generations, the Vance Ranch was known as a place where children without families could find one, where love was given freely, where broken things were mended. The house Julia and Zach had built stood for over 100 years. It weathered storms and droughts and the changing world outside its walls. The porch where they'd sat together sagged and was repaired and sagged again. The bedrooms where 7 children had slept and dreamed held new children, new dreams. The kitchen where Julia had cooked thousands of meals fed new families. And through it all, the story was told and retold. Of a lonely cowboy and a desperate widow, of a wedding night confession and a promise to fill their home with love, of 7 children who'd been chosen and cherished and taught that family was something you built, not something you were born with. It was a simple story in many ways. Just 2 people who found each other and decided to love, who extended that love to children who needed it, who created something lasting from the broken pieces of their pasts. But simple didn't mean small. That love rippled out across generations, touching hundreds of lives, changing the world in ways Julia and Zach never could have imagined when they stood in that dusty Aurora Street in 1878. Because that's what love does. It grows and spreads and multiplies. It takes root in unexpected places and blooms in seasons of drought. It survives loss and pain and the relentless march of time. It becomes the foundation on which everything else is built. Julia Marlowe Vance and Zachary Vance built their foundation on a simple promise: we'll fill our home with love. And they kept that promise every single day for 42 years, creating a family that proved love was always enough, biology was optional, and the truest bonds were the ones you chose. Their story ended the way all stories do, with death and grief and the passing of time. But it also continued, in the lives they'd touched, and the children they'd raised, and the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their names and their values forward into a world that desperately needed both. And if you'd asked any of those descendants what they remembered most about Julia and Zach, they would have said the same thing. They loved each other completely, and they loved us the same way. They taught us that family isn't about blood. It's about showing up and staying and choosing each other every single day. That's the legacy they left us, and it's worth more than gold. The house is gone now, torn down in the 1980s to make room for a highway. The ranch land was sold off piece by piece. The barn collapsed in a storm. The physical things that Julia and Zach built have mostly disappeared, returned to the earth from which they came. But the love remains. It lives on in the descendants who still gather every summer for reunions, over 100 people now, all connected to two people who met in 1878 and decided to build something beautiful. It lives in the stories they tell their children about the great-great-grandparents who adopted orphans when nobody else would. It lives in the family motto someone stitched on a sampler long ago: love is always enough. That's what Julia learned when she stood on Zach's porch that first day, desperate and afraid. That's what Zach learned when she whispered her secret on their wedding night and he didn't turn away. That's what 7 orphan children learned when they were chosen and cherished and given a home. Love is always enough. Not easy, not simple, not without pain or sacrifice, but enough. Always enough. More than enough. And in a wild west town in Colorado in 1878, 2 lonely people discovered that truth and built a life on it. They filled their home with love just as Zach promised they would. And that love grew into something neither of them could have imagined. A family, a legacy, a light in the darkness that has never gone out. That's not just their story. It's the story of everyone who's ever been broken and found healing, who's ever been alone and found family, who's ever believed that love might not be enough and then discovered it was the only thing that ever truly mattered. It's a story worth remembering, worth telling, worth carrying forward into whatever future awaits. Because the world still needs to hear that love is enough, that families can be built from choice and commitment, that broken things can be mended if someone cares enough to try. Julia and Zach cared. They tried. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, they're together still, watching the sunset over Colorado mountains, holding hands and smiling at the beautiful, messy, perfect family they created from nothing but love and hope and determination. Their home is filled with love still, even though the house is gone. It's filled with the love of all the people who came after them, who learned from their example, who believe in their promise. It's filled with the love of orphan children who became beloved sons and daughters. It's filled with the love of a lonely cowboy and a desperate widow who found each other in the wilderness and built something that will never die. And that's how their story ends. Not with death, but with love. Always with love. Forever with love. Because they filled their home with it, and that love became eternal.